It is considered that beauties are the lucky ones who have perfect facial features and figures. Only history refutes this misconception. They were admired by the most famous and influential men, famous poems were dedicated to them, fortunes and even entire countries were thrown at their feet. But why do ugly women look at us from portraits of the most famous beauties of the past? So, let's figure out which of the most famous beauties of history are difficult to call beauties. And what really was the secret of their attractiveness? What did the legendary Cleopatra look like in reality, and how did she convince everyone of her beauty? What was it that Queen Margot conquered men so much? Why was Anna of Austria considered one of the most beautiful women in Europe? And how the bald, toothless Elizabeth Tudor became a recognized beauty? The most fateful ugly beauty of Russian history. How did the laundress Marta Skafranskaya so conquer the Russian emperor? What the genius of pure beauty, Pushkin's muse Anna Kern, really looked like? And the riddle is ugly Lily Brick. A symbol of female beauty of all times and peoples, one of the most beautiful women in the history of the world. This is how the famous Cleopatra is portrayed in numerous films by the most beautiful actresses of cinema. All Caesar's biographers are unanimous. Cleopatra made the deepest impression on the experienced ladies' man during the first meeting. He fell passionately in love with her, but what was he so stunned by? Let's look at the lifetime image of the most beautiful woman of the ancient world. Hooked nose, protruding chin. The coins with her image from Alexandria generally have some male facial features. And this is what the reconstruction of the legendary beauty looks like, made on the basis of all her lifetime images by modern scientists. Historians of the British Museum came to the conclusion that Cleopatra, at least by the end of her 38 years of life, was a rather stout, stocky woman of small stature, 52 meters tall, had a long nose and bad teeth. Yes, it turns out that there was nowhere for beauty to come from. She belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, most of whom were not very beautiful. You can't help but wonder why she so impressed Caesar. So, it seems that it was not at all in the right facial features, but in a remarkable mind, excellent education and charm. This is confirmed by the Greek historian Plutarch, who wrote that her external beauty was not at all incomparable, but she talked with irresistible charm. Contemporaries also noted that everything breathed voluptuousness in Cleopatra. Her provocative sexuality was also emphasized by clothes chosen with exquisite taste. It turns out, don't be born beautiful, but be born smart. Margarita d'Avilois, who, by the way, no one called Queen Margot during her lifetime, is one of the most famous women in history, largely thanks to the novel by Alexandre Dumas and his equally famous film adaptations. The court chronicler said of her, if there was anyone perfect in beauty, it was the Queen of Navarre. And now look, in this portrait, 21 years old, perfect in beauty. There is a mention that she was very similar in appearance to her mother in the shape of her face, with slightly drooping cheeks. At the same time, her contemporaries vied with each other in admiring her appearance, white satin skin and curvy forms. One of the ambassadors wrote, to visit the court without seeing Marguerite Voies means not to see either France or the French court. It is also interesting that Dumas and biographers describe Margarita de Valois as a bright brunette, and an obvious blonde looks at us from the portraits. It turns out that the whole point is that Margarita sometimes wore a light curly wig, fashionable at that time. In it, she poses for portraits. Well, how far from the beauty seemed to everyone to be a perfect beauty, as she was perceived by far not only flatterers. It seems, again, it's all about charm, intelligence and the ability to present yourself. It is known that Margarita was famous for her intelligence. By the age of 16, she had studied several languages, read Homer in the original, played music, studied philosophy, mathematics and anatomy. Contemporaries noted her ability to dress. She chose outfits in such a way that always attracted everyone's attention. She could flash in black for no reason or come with her hair down, just because it suits her. In general, intelligence, taste, charm and education are the recipe for her famous beauty. The fame of the most beautiful woman of her time was consolidated because of the famous Virgin Queen Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of Anne Boleyn, executed by her husband Henry VIII. The queen herself also tried to be beautiful. Tons of cosmetics, luxurious outfits. But, it turns out, she tried to hide her flaws with cosmetics. At the age of 29, Elizabeth suffered a serious illness and became bald, and therefore constantly wore wigs. In addition, there were traces of smallpox on her face, which she made up with tons of powder, and then she was just stuffed with harmful substances and poison. The lead in the powder turned the queen's skin gray. To this add black rotten teeth, from which there was a terrible smell. The thing is that Elizabeth Tudor had a terrible sweet tooth and couldn't help herself. But you can't change yourself, change the circumstances. And the queen introduced the fashion for black teeth at court. Now the owner of a white-toothed smile was forced to blacken their teeth so as not to seem ugly. In public, the queen showed up in a ton of makeup, but she tried not to show anyone what was under it. Elizabeth even ordered all the mirrors to be removed from the room, because under layers of whitewash, luxurious clothes, and jewelry, not a brilliant queen was hiding, but an almost bald old woman with a pockmarked face and no teeth. But the glory of the most beautiful was created by her subjects, who tried their best to embellish her appearance. So much so that it is now difficult to restore Elizabeth's natural appearance. The portraits primarily depict her as an object of worship and greatly flatter. The Austrian is another famous beauty on the throne. In Dumas' novel, the all-powerful Cardinals Richelieu and the Duke of Buckingham were madly in love with her. Of course, he is a novel on the basis that much of it is just fiction. But the same Queen Anne of Austria of the Three Musketeers really sent the first beauty of Europe. And here's how the famous Rubens depicted her. In the portrait she is about 25 years old. She belonged to the Habsburg dynasty, who, out of love for closely related marriages, were famous for their, to put it mildly, unattractive appearance. Her husband, according to court rumors, spent all the time with his minions, and was not interested in his wife at all. As a result, for 23 years, the king and queen had no children and, according to rumors, only thanks to Richelieu's persuasions, the couple still had 2 sons, one of whom will go down in history as the Sun King Louis XIV. By the way, the same story with the pendants and the Duke of Buckingham is not just a fiction of Dumas. It is described in his memoirs by the courtier and philosopher François de la Rochefoucauld. However, some contemporaries considered the memoirs to be lies. According to one version, the legend of Anna's incomparable beauty appeared at the Spanish court, which declared each of its princesses a written beauty, regardless of her appearance. Well, then the confidence of the princess in her exceptional appearance worked. That is, this is the very situation in which first you work for the image, and then it works for you. The most fatal beauties of our history, at whose feet a man in love through an entire empire, peasant Marta Skavronskaya, who went down in history as the Russian Empress Catherine I. Just think what a fantastic career. From a laundress to become a sovereign empress. But what so seduced the loving king, spoiled by the attention of women? Let's take a look at her portrait. It is difficult to call her a beauty, however, male contemporaries described her as very attractive. Menshikov lost his head before the Tsar because of her, but women categorically did not like her. They say, an ordinary simpleton who has no taste. And how could he have come from an illiterate peasant woman, who had previously been the marching wife of Peter's companions? But then how could the Tsar, after the refined boyar daughter Evdokia Lopakina or the refined German Anna Mons, get so carried away with her that he even got married? It is quite possible that the whole point is that she was a real colleague of Peter. She always accompanied him on all trips without exception, even when she was pregnant. I shared with him all the hardships of camping romance, slept in tents or even on the street, ate whatever I had to. And also, as a true friend of life, she was able to be very attentive to Peter. The emperor suffered from seizures of epilepsy, and only she could recognize the slightest signs of an impending attack and make it less intense. In the same way, she perfectly felt the slightest shades of Peter's sharply changing mood and was able to extinguish another explosion. As a real colleague, she also took on herself when the emperor was in serious danger during the Prutsky campaign. She offered to seduce the enemy who surrounded the Russians with expensive gifts and without thinking took off all the jewelry. On the other hand, Marta Skavronskaya turned out to be very similar to Peter's mother Natalia Narishkina, whom he loved very much. Perhaps the answer is also in this. This is Anna Kern, the one whom the great Pushkin will call a genius of pure beauty in his famous poem I Remember a Wonderful Moment. This is her only reliable portrait, unfortunately, tiny. We have a pretty woman in front of us, but you can't call her a beauty, much less a genius of pure beauty. But in this portrait, which was considered hers for a long time, just like another woman turned out to be. Delvik, Pushkin's brother, was madly in love with Kern. His father also proposed to her, and she, having left her hated husband and renounced her position in society, married a second cousin who was 20 years younger than her. They lived in poverty-love for 40 years. Many of her verbal descriptions have been preserved. Here is what the poet Andrei Podolinsky writes: "When the eye is slender and bright, it stands in front of me, I think, burning the prophet, brought down from heaven to earth." And here is how the future professor of philology Alexander Nikitenko describes the first meeting with her. There were many guests, including a new face, which, I must admit, made quite a strong impression on me. When I went down to the living room in the evening, it instantly attracted my attention. It was the face of a young woman of striking beauty. But I was most attracted to her touching languor in the expression of her eyes, smiles and the sounds of her voice. Kern loved poetry, felt its musicality subtly and was a wonderful listener, which, of course, always attracts men. Pushkin described her in a letter as follows: "She is elegant, she understands everything, is easily upset and is just as easily comforted. She has timid manners and bold actions, but at the same time she is wonderfully attractive." And here's what Turgenev wrote about Banna Kern: "A little like a Russian-made Ola Porosha. If I were Pushkin, I wouldn't write poetry to her." The love union of Lily Brick and her husband Osip Brick and Vladimir Mayakovsky is one of the most famous in history. Men were really crazy about her. Nikolai Punin wrote, "Her pupils turn into eyelashes and darken with excitement. She has solemn eyes. There is something brazen and sweet in her face with painted lips and dark eyelids." This most charming woman knows a lot about human love and sensual love. In all descriptions of Lily Brick, it is striking how differently men and women perceived her. Dyed hair and impudent eyes on a worn-out face, this is Anna Akhmatova. And here is Galina Kativa. That day she had such a tic that she kept a bone spoon in her mouth to keep her teeth from chattering. The first impression is very eccentric and at the same time very ladylike. Sleek, refined and... my God, she's not pretty. The head is too big, the back is stooped and this terrible tic. But after a second I didn't remember about it. She smiled at me, and the whole face seemed to flash with this smile, lit up from the inside. And indeed, if Lilia Brick wanted to captivate someone, she achieved it very easily. And everyone wanted to like her, young, old, women, children. It was in her blood and she liked it. Lilia could charm a person in just a few minutes of conversation. Even those with whom she met already in the 60s, talked about her extraordinary charisma. There was a riddle in her that no one could solve, so her name is still overgrown with tall tales and legends and encourages us to try to understand. So what is beauty, and does it have anything to do with appearance, figure, correct facial features? Or is it a reflection of the inner content, self-confidence gained through the mind? Is it possible to become beautiful without being a beauty? To this question, many famous beauties of stories throughout their lives answered yes. If you also think that this story is interesting, subscribe. Do not forget to click on the notification bell.